Well, thank you for joining me for this next set of our In Conversation series. I'm so delighted to be here today with John Allen, former general, current president of the Brookings Institution, recent author of a new book entitled Turning Point: Policymaking in an Era of Artificial Intelligence. John, thank you so much for joining me today. I know there's a few different topics I'd love to cover and get your point of view on, but given the time in which we live, I think we should naturally start with the COVID-19, with this pandemic. We've seen the world change so much this year. You and I were together with others in Munich in February. Little did we know as we were having lunch that we wouldn't have an opportunity to have lunch together for longer than either of us would have imagined. But one of the things that brought us to the Munich Security Conference was the importance of multilateralism, as governments have often come together at the Munich Security Conference to discuss. As you look at the response to COVID-19, are there new lessons that we should take away from this in terms of the role of multilateralism as we look to the future?
Well, first, Brad, it's wonderful to see you. I'm sorry we're not having a dinner in Munich, but we'll get there eventually, and we'll have dinner in the United States too, hopefully soon. I don't see us being able to get out of this crisis without a renewed commitment to multilateralism. I've had the opportunity to work in 5 global coalitions. The first was the rescue and the relief operation for the South Asia tsunami. And the last one was just a couple of years ago dealing with the Islamic State. And we have found over time that the hardest challenges that we face, the greatest difficulties that we encounter, are best ultimately solved by multilateral approaches. And I think one of the very important outcomes of this in the context of creating a consciousness, a global consciousness, is that it has pointed to inequality in such a powerful way around the world. Inequality in the United States, our communities of color, our native communities, the disadvantaged and vulnerable elements of our population. So dealing with COVID as a public health issue, dealing with the economic downturn as an economic imperative, dealing with inequality as it has emerged, and dealing with the other real crisis that we face now, which has been brought very clearly into focus, which is climate. All of these things demand, it's an absolute imperative that we deal with this at a multilateral level. And I got to be clear on this, because there are folks today and over the last few years who have envisaged multilateralism in the context of transactionalism, where it is more about what one can get from the other than it is about what I would say, what you would say, Brad. I know you would say this, and that is not a hegemonic multilateralism, but a multilateralism that stems from conscious leadership and a desire for a transformational outcome, where the coalition together, the multilateral organization together, the multilateral undertaking together is transformationally greater than simply the sum of the parts. And it's when we go after these problems and these challenges with that as our mindset that we truly will have the ability not just to solve COVID as a disease and COVID as an economic crisis, but to deal with these issues of massive global inequality, prepare ourselves for the challenges of climate, and very importantly, position ourselves in the future so that we can see the next pandemic coming, because it is coming, and we have to be prepared for that. That will require, it will demand, and it is imperative that we deal with this at a multilateral level.
One of the things that is happening this week in New York is I guess it's the virtual now celebration of the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. As we think about this new challenge to the world on the UN's 75th anniversary, what do you see in terms of what we need in the future, what we're likely to see in the future from, say, the United Nations or some of the other great multilateral institutions that came after the end of World War II, the IMF, the World Bank, the Bretton Woods institutions, and the like? In short, what should their agenda be for the next quarter century?
Well, I think they're only more relevant as we continue into this century. Look, I'm a completely unrepentant internationalist. I believe in the global community dealing as a community with the problems that we face, and the United Nations was absolutely essential to that. And the mindset which gave birth to the United Nations and the Bretton Woods Agreement, the mindset that created the World Bank Group and the IMF, as you said, and the family of communities that stems from the UN Food Program, the United Nations Development Program, the World Health Organization, all of these are as relevant today as they were when they were established 75 years ago. It doesn't mean they can't change. It doesn't mean they can't be reimagined. And in this moment of global health crisis, one of the things that we ought to be consistently doing is trying to reimagine institutions as they existed before that crisis to ensure that as we recover, we modify those institutions as may be necessary for their continued relevance in the future. So I am absolutely convinced that the United Nations remains as relevant today as it was when it was created. So I think on the 75th anniversary, and happy birthday, UN, you've had a hard time getting to this point because it hasn't been easy. But in so many ways, we have the capacity to see a trajectory for the benefit of all humankind if we look at that trajectory through the lens of the United Nations and multilateralism.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great point. And let's just say, at least or especially for global institutions like the United Nations, life only gets better after you've hit your 75th year. That should be our hope.
There, Brad, too. I'm telling you.
Even before the pandemic hit, John, there was increasing concern about the backsliding of democracies, about the increase in authoritarianism, concerns about authoritarian countries like, say, Russia or China. What do you think the United States and the U.S. government should be doing to advance the state of democracy in the world?
Well, I think it's absolutely essential to our future. There's just no question in my mind. And, so I'll say this because I am older than you. I know that. As we saw the end of the Cold War, clearly end in what we would imagine at that time as being in our favor, I think there was a sense that the arc of history was going to deliver us probably irrevocably into a community of democracies. And there was great hope that there were democracies, there were proto-democracies, and there were going to be those that we'd have to deal with along the way, authoritarian and totalitarian regimes. I'm less confident about that now. And in conversations you and I have had, there are some very powerful indices on the slippage, if you will, of democracy in the last several years. The Economist is one. Freedom House is another. Freedom House has said that in 2019, it was the 13th straight year of the slippage of democracy. And as we go forward in the world, as we have to contend with authoritarian values that are very much inimical to ours, that very much fly in the face of what is important to us, our human rights, the rule of law, freedom of speech, the rights of women, all of those things that are so important to not just the United States, but the community of democracies, we have to take steps to get organized in the future, ultimately to reverse this degradation of democracy as a system of government and democracies as individual states. Because what will happen is if we don't begin to think about this as a full community, first and foremost based on our values, if we don't start to think about this as a community, then we will find the continued degradation of democracy as a system and the continued loss of freedom for peoples around the world. And I think we have to think in those terms. Just very briefly, the term the West, for example, it has relevance, but I think that the term today, the West, has become an exclusive term. In many respects, when we look at East Asia, some of the most vibrant democracies that embrace and uphold the same rights that we have enshrined in our own constitution and we hold so dear, they have highly advanced technologies, they have very sophisticated economies, wealthy economies, they are committed to the human rights of their people. And often when we have the conversation about democracies and inclusiveness, we don't include those great democracies in East Asia or India or Australia and New Zealand. And when we think about the global approach, ultimately to stemming the slide of democracy as a system and the winking out of governments that used to be democracies and are now proto-authoritarian states, we have got to think more inclusively around the globe about a community that can come together to pool their values, to pool the power of their economies, to pool the innovation of their technologies. And I think that it's a very bright future if we can begin to think in those terms.
Yeah, in the world today, building on that, you sometimes encounter people who say, look, the world has changed, technology has changed, economies have changed, authoritarian countries are better positioned to outcompete the democracies of the world. What is your answer to that point of view?
Well, there's a lot of power in technology. And as I think we've had this conversation, Brad and others, technology in the end is neutral. How it is ultimately developed and how it is applied is really a function of the values either of the entity that is developing the technology or the country that is employing the technology. And so for democracies, which are inherently open societies that respect the rule of law, the privacy of their citizens, the human rights of the individuals, we are inherently susceptible to those who would use many of these technologies ultimately to their own benefit, either to surveil and suppress or oppress their own citizens, or by keeping us off balance, by intruding through our own platforms into the minds of our youth and our decision makers to sow a sense of a lack of confidence in our democratic processes, in our voting, in our democratic institutions. And so, from my perspective, we have to be on guard constantly to ensure that the technologies that we want to employ are working for the benefit of our citizens, but at the same time be prepared to protect our citizens from those elements globally that are employing technologies first to surveil, control, and suppress their own dissident elements in their populations and their populations writ large, but also to keep us off balance in the cybersphere. They don't have to be kinetic. They don't have to go to war with us. They can keep us off balance in the cybersphere by using these same technologies. We have to first be conscious of that. We have to first understand that that is a vulnerability of our society and do what we can, both to protect the privacy and the individual rights of our citizens, at the same time, protect ourselves from that intrusion.
I think that really leads almost naturally to your book, Turning Point. And one of the things I appreciate about your book is how it has brought you to really thinking about some of the same issues that I've had the good fortune to work on, including with people at the Brookings Institution. Clearly there's a hugely important issue for our time about artificial intelligence and both the potential it has to do good, but also the challenges it is creating. How do you think today about the balance between these benefits and risks in artificial intelligence?
Well, as I said, the technology in and of itself is inherently neutral. It will depend on the values of the society itself that employs it as to whether it's employed ultimately for the good or potentially to the detriment of the people involved. And so I see that artificial intelligence has enormous potential, as we said in the book in multiple chapters, to make life better in healthcare, in transportation, in education, in the context of metropolitan areas, smart cities. Enormous potential for good. But as we move forward, we have to be conscious of some of the limitations of the technology, the inherent biases that are unleashed in artificial intelligence, because as you well know, no one better than you, artificial intelligence is really a function of big data acquisition, big data analytics, and computing power. And in many respects, the application of algorithms is no better than the data ultimately that it will be processing. And we've got to take steps necessary to ensure that the data isn't inherently biased or discriminatory. And that's a challenge that we'll have going forward. It's a responsibility that we have going forward. And in an environment where these technologies produced in many respects by the private sector as compared to necessarily in the government many years ago. As we continue to move forward with the sophistication and the pervasiveness of these technologies, we have to think about the policy solutions, both to help to protect our innovative juices, if you will, our ability to bring that innovation to application, but at the same time protect the privacy of our citizens and their inherent rights. And I do believe that while the technology has in fact charged forward, that there is now a growing thirst and a hunger for policy, ultimately, and then potentially legislation, but policy to help to govern that technology in ways that ultimately are useful for our citizens, but also inherently protects the opportunity to continue to innovate. And we have to find that balance between the two. That is not a problem in the authoritarian states. They're going to be moving pell-mell towards the improvement of that technology and the citizens' rights, citizens' privacy, the surveillance of large segments or communities within the population. That is a secondary consideration. And so we as a democracy have an obligation to both create the policy frameworks within which then this technology can be the most beneficial to society, but not strangle the capacity for that technology and the private sector in our societies and in our culture, not strangle the capacity for them to continue to innovate.
Well, I think that gives us some real food for thought, as we sum up here. And I just want to thank you again, John, for spending the time with us. I think your book is a terrific addition to the conversation we all need to have. For those who haven't had a chance to read it yet, I would definitely recommend it. Turning Point: Policymaking in an Era of Artificial Intelligence. I think what I most appreciate is you're bringing to these issues of the future and technology values that I think are really timeless, that go to the heart of democracy, the protection of people's freedoms, the need to make sure that we're doing all of this in a way that serves other people well. So thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for everyone at the Brookings Institution. I'm glad you're safe and well. Look forward to seeing you in person soon.
Thank you, Brad. Remain safe and well yourself and everyone at Microsoft. Thank you very much. Good day.
Thank you. See you. Bye.